Everybody, good evening. Welcome. My name is Jim Anaya. I'm the Dean of the Law School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here to this kickoff of the 4th annual Martz Spring Symposium. You can read more about Clyde Martz in your program, but simply put, Professor Martz is considered one of the fathers of natural resources law here in the United States. He taught here at Colorado Law for 15 years and was a co-founder of the Natural Resources Law Center, which later became the Getchus Wilkinson Center, which is the sponsor of the symposium. Professor Martz later joined the law firm of Davis, Graham & Stubbs, and members of the firm, spearheaded by Brian Dolan, who I believe is here tonight. Brian? Is he? No? Not yet. He will be, or maybe. They established the Martz Natural Resources Management Fund in memory of this natural resources law pioneer. Because of the generosity of people like Brian and his firm, we can offer events like this, which is free and open to the public. So, to Brian and his firm, or his former firm, Davis, Graham & Stubbs, on behalf of the law school community, thank you for your commitment to excellence and innovation in natural resources law. It is a particular pleasure to welcome you to this Oxford-style debate on a topic of great significance on a global scale. The Paris Agreement on Climate Change is a landmark and historical treaty that addresses the pressing issue of climate change. It commits all parties to undertake collective efforts based on nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases to pre-industrial levels. Tonight's debate on whether the U.S. should remain a party to the Paris Agreement addresses an issue of very, very timely relevance. We are grateful to Alice Madden, the Executive Director of the Getchus Wilkinson Center, for organizing the Martz Symposium, setting up this important this debate this evening, and securing such distinguished speakers who will be introduced in a moment. I'm going to now hand it over to Alice to get things started, and I hope you all enjoy the debate.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Anaya. It's such a pleasure to have you here at Colorado Law. Dean Jim Anaya has been with us since July, and we're incredibly excited to have him here. So I'm Alice Madden. I run the Getchus Wilkinson Center for Natural Resources, Energy, and the Environment. And we're really pleased to start the Martz Symposium with a public debate that's free and open to the public. We're a public law school. I won't go on too long about this, but you probably know we get less than 4% of revenue at CU Boulder from the state. So we depend on our sponsors. Their names have been flashing on the screen there, and people like Brian Dolan, who started this fund to be able to support the Martz Symposium, are really a huge part of having access to this information to the public. We're continuing tomorrow for a symposium that we have tiered rates for nonprofits and government folks. So we're trying to make sure that we get this information out to the larger community. So I have one really big thank you before we start, and that, there's always one person who really does all the work, and that's Sean LaBar. I think he's probably outside. Sean, are you inside, outside? All right, wave. Let's please give Sean a big round of applause. These things, go smoothly until they don't, and he's really just, rolled with it all. So a couple of logistics. At the end of the evening, you all have your clickers to vote. If you don't, raise your hands. We can get you them. I was told to be sure you actually turn it on, power it up, and make sure. And then we'll hand them out. You can raise your hand in a second as Sean comes around. So power them up. Just that's what I've been told to remind everyone. But on your way out, if you can drop your clickers in a basket. If you don't want to keep your agenda, please return it. We'll use it tomorrow during the symposium. And we also handed out index cards. If you end up not using your index card to ask a question, you can return that there. So alrighty, we are ready to begin. The other thing I want to just point out, the bios, Sean, one more in the middle. The bios of our moderator and our speakers are in the brochure. So we're not going to read them tonight. I get to introduce the moderator. He's the perfect person to moderate this debate among the faculty. He's the Nicholas Domain Professor of International Environmental Law, Lakshmi Guruswamy. Take it away. Thank you.
So thank you very much, and it's delightful to see so many people present here today. We are looking forward to a really exciting debate. My function is just to spend 2 or 3 minutes describing the Paris Agreement on climate change, but I have one distinction, which is that I possessed a red card. Have you seen that before? Well, that's what they hand out in soccer games if they want you kicked out. And if the speakers exceed their time limits, then they get a red card. And I'm sure that's how it's going to happen. All right. So the background information to the Paris Agreement, as our dean has said, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change of 2015 is a treaty under international law. It was negotiated by a lawmaking assembly, followed the legal requirements pertaining to the finalization of the text of the treaty. These are all formal requirements under international law: signature, ratification, and coming into force. It was signed by the United States on 22nd April 2016 and ratified by President Obama on September 3rd, 2016 by executive order. The Paris Agreement came into force on November 4th, 2016, and as of date, 142 countries have ratified and are bound by the treaty. So it is a very all-encompassing treaty. The globally transformative objective of the Paris Agreement is to hold increases of temperature to 2 degrees below pre-industrial levels, 2 degrees below pre-industrial levels. Now, the Paris Agreement was not submitted to the Senate for advice and consent. It was treated as an executive agreement and not as a treaty. But under international law, executive agreements, as well as what in the United States law are deemed treaties, are still part of treaty law and is binding on the United States. The motion for today assumes that the US is a party to an international agreement, the Paris Agreement, and the question for debate is whether we should remain a member of the treaty or withdraw from it. This is a question of international law, and so let me very quickly, in the next minute and a half, try to simplify, for those who are not familiar with the arcane nature of international law, how the Paris Agreement works. Now, think of each of the 196 countries of the world as possessing harmful and hazardous luggage or baggage called greenhouse gases. This is the assumption of the treaty. So I'm just articulating the assumption of the treaty. So these 196 nations have this hazardous baggage called greenhouse gas emissions. Every country in the world is then invited to board individual buses provided by the Paris Agreement bus company, along with their greenhouse gas emission baggage. The purpose of the journey is to load the baggage onto the bus and get rid of it before it reaches the destination. So that is the crux of the treaty. Now, none of the countries in the world are required or obliged to board the bus, as they can refuse to do so. They can say, I don't want to get out of the bus, I want to keep my baggage. But if they decide to board the bus, each party must give the driver of the bus a ticket called a nationally determined contribution, NDC, stating how much hazardous baggage he or she will throw out during the journey. That's the purpose of the journey. Put the baggage on the bus, throw it out. There is no requirement as to how much you should throw out. So some parties will be throwing out more than others and some less. So developed countries will be throwing out presumably more baggage. Developing countries may not. But once you get on board this bus, you must keep reducing your baggage. You cannot hang on to it. Once you decide to get board, you have to hang on to it. Secondly, you cannot get off the bus except under the circumstances laid out by the bus company, which is the international law. So that's the crux of it. The Obama administration submitted our nationally determined contributions amounting to 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. And so we will leave the two debaters to flesh out the Paris Agreement. So we have 2 terrific, gifted debaters for today's debate. Karen Florini, former Deputy Special Envoy for Climate Change at the US Department of State, will be representing the yes position, the position that yes, we should remain a party to the Paris Agreement. And Stephen Hayward, Senior Resident Scholar, Institute of Governmental Studies at UC Berkeley, will be representing the no position. Stephen also was the distinguished professor of constitutional something important here at the University of Colorado, conservative studies, I think, yeah. Okay, so you can read more about our distinguished guests in the program. But please help me welcome them at this point. Oh, hold on. Oh, well, I'm the conductor. So let me outline the debates, this Oxford-style debate, which has been demonstrated, which has beautifully been crafted by Alice Madden. So the debate goes like this. Each speaker, listen guys, I have the red card, will have 7 minutes for their opening remarks. And then each speaker will have 3 minutes in rebuttal. So they have 10 minutes each. Following this, I will ask each of the speakers, the man with the red card, will ask a few questions and provide each debater 3 minutes. So I'll ask each person 3 questions, that's all. Following this, I will ask each of the speakers, I hope to take a few questions from the audience. So at this point, I just want to make sure that you have clickers, that you have index cards. Have you got it to write your questions? No? Everybody got both clickers and index cards? Okay. Now, we will ask you to start, before we start the debate, we will ask you to place your pre-debate motion, to register your pre-debate motions, because there are two votes being taken today. One, before our wonderful debaters get into action, and 2, after the debate. So would you please, before we commence the debate, take out your clicker, raise your hands if you don't have it, and then please register your vote. The vote is whether that the United States should remain, it's up there, the US should remain a party to the Paris Agreement. Now, Sean, will you have to tell them something about how I don't know how to do this? You know, how, because this is beyond my pay grade. Yeah, so what have you got to do?
Well, you see the question right there? A is in favor, B is opposed, C is undecided. Give me 1 second.
Oh. You know, sometimes the power button doesn't work, right? I don't know. Don't ask me. I'm the village idiot. I don't know how to work that damn thing. No, I know this damn thing works. Right. 1 person, 1 vote. Yes, please. Just 1 person, 1 vote. And yeah, no, this is not Chicago. This is Boulder, but we might as well keep to the rules, right? Yeah. You get bitten by it. No, it doesn't. No, it shouldn't. It shouldn't. But I'm assuming that you'll only press it once, right? Oh, is that RB all right then? Okay. I don't know how this damn thing works. We're about to start kick off now. Okay, whatever. Have you done this business before, this clicking business?
Very seldom.
No, I mean, what do I know? Are we ready to go? Oh, I got my water here. Yeah. Would you like one? Okay. That for Karen? What for you?
I'm good.
Oh, holy moly. Okay. Oh, God. Okay, so we have a really detached, balanced audience that hasn't made up his mind about anything except that they like the motion. So the man who's going to oppose the motion is Stephen. We did a kind of toss of the coin. So it's your show, Stephen, and you have 7 minutes. Thank you so much.
Let me move this so I have a little room. And I'm going to start my own little stopwatch so that I have some idea where I am, because I don't want a red card.
No, you don't want to.
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, it's a delight to be back in Wolf Hall, the greatest name ever for a law school in the universe, if you go by the lawyer cliches, right? And I love those numbers. I mean, I always, when I come to Boulder, now I'm at Berkeley, I always have General Custer's attitude, which is don't take any prisoners. My candid view is that the Paris Accord is irrelevant and could be ignored, and I think will be ignored or fiddled with by other nations. But I think getting rid of it formally would be a salutary act of political hygiene. When I look at the entire arc of climate diplomacy, stretching back to the beginning of this at the Rio conference in 1992, I'm reminded of Winston Churchill's characterization of the peace and disarmament conferences of the 1920s and 30s, which he called a prolonged and solemn farce. And the Paris Accord, to me, is the equivalent of the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. Do you remember that from high school? That was the treaty which leading nations, including signatories Germany and Japan, said that they would disavow war as an instrument of national policy. It was the only instance of foolishness that ever came from the otherwise criminally underrated Coolidge administration. Of course, as everyone knows, within 10 years, the armies of the world were on the march in the largest war in human history. And I'm sure a few more League of Nations memoranda and annexes could have prevented that, but you might want to check with Neville Chamberlain about his particular piece of paper that thought he would prevent war. My point is obvious. Pieces of paper do not deliver us low and non-carbon energy on the scale that we need it. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, by the way, is still on the books. It's still part of the international law books. Never been repealed or explicitly repudiated. Even the diplomatic community thinks it's not worth bothering with. So the Paris Accord is similar to the Kellogg-Briand Pact as it represents itself as a pathway for leading nations and ultimately all nations to disavow the use of virtually all fossil fuels as instruments of national energy policy in a very short time horizon. Now, the Council on the Parties, as it's called, Karen's been to a lot of those, I imagine. They meet every year, and not all of them, but a lot of them put forth what they said were breakthrough declarations after the Kyoto came kind of a train wreck after 1997, 98. I'm not sure I have the names right. There was the Durban Platform, the Doha Desideratum, the Cancun Commitment, the Berlin Bulletin, the Bali Ballyhoo. Those names aren't right, actually. It doesn't matter. They were all silly, right? They were frivolous exercises, and that essentially amounted to, let's get together next year and keep talking. Is Paris fundamentally different from any of those? I was really shocked at the people who said, people like Fred Krupp of Environmental Defense, who wrote in the Wall Street Journal a couple days later, this is it, this is the breakthrough that's going to save the planet. I thought, seriously? Consider just a few data points. The recently overthrown Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Pact was over 1,000 pages long. NAFTA was 800 or 1,000 pages or something like that. Our arms control treaties, when we used to have them, were very long and lots of technical detail. By the way, trade and arms control were two of the diplomatic models for the climate process in ways that would take a while to explain. Those treaties had very strict deadlines and a relatively robust enforcement mechanism. The Paris Accord is 32 pages long. It would probably only be 10 pages if you took out all the participles. That length should itself tell you that it doesn't amount to much. And for my first witness on behalf of that point is NASA's James Hansen, their premier climate scientist. I'm sure most of you are familiar with him. He describes the Paris Accord as, I'll use his word now, a fraud. It is wishful thinking that mainly reaffirms 25 years later the 1992 Rio Framework Convention on Climate Change. I'll quote him a little further. It's a fake. It's just bullshit for them to say, we'll have a 2 degrees Celsius warming target and then try to do a little better every 5 years. It's just worthless words. There's no action, just promises. And here's the key sentence. As long as fossil fuels appear to be the cheapest fuels out there, they will continue to be burned. Now, why does he say that? Well, he knows the math of these things, and that full compliance of the entire world with the terms of, with their nationally determined contributions would prevent about maybe 1/10 of 1 degree of warming. Our contribution is going to be the full implementation of the Clean Power Plan from President Obama, which the EPA admits, if fully implemented in our electricity sector, would prevent 2 1/100ths of 1 degree of warming in the year 2100. That's why all the benefits in their regulatory analysis come from reducing particulates, not carbon dioxide. Second data point, and this one ought to be a matter of curiosity. Most of the major oil companies, starting with ExxonMobil, Chevron, I think BP, Shell, the others, they've all said to President Trump, we think you should stay in the Paris Accord. And just in the last week, one coal company, and also I understand Peabody and Arch Coal, have told the Trump administration that they think the United States should stay in the Paris Accord. Now, when you consider that climate policy orthodoxy calls for phasing out virtually all fossil fuels in a 33-year time horizon, the question you'd ask of these coal companies and oil companies is, are they suicidal? I mean, if they really think that this is a framework for making their business model obsolete, that would be like typewriter companies cheering on the development of word processing software and desktop computers and laser printers 30 years ago. No, I suspect that they have taken in the terms of the agreement and they recognize that the Paris Accord is no fundamental or existential threat to their business model, similar to the way the tobacco companies 25 years ago embraced the master settlement agreement with the states because it guaranteed they'd stay in business forever. Other parts of this, and I'm running out of time for my opening, is an awful lot of developing nations that had resisted making previous firm commitments were enticed this time by promises of $100 billion a year in aid from developed nations. I wonder how much of that is getting through. I haven't tried to add it up. I think we committed $500 million so far. There's not much enforcement mechanism for nations that breach their promises. There's one part of it that I think is sensible. There's an emphasis on adaptation, very prominent in the document. But that's going to happen anyway, and we actually don't need a piece of paper from the UN for that to take place. And for additional points, I will wait till my rebuttal period. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate. It's really a delight. This is my first visit to Boulder, and I've really enjoyed the opportunity to spend a little bit of time here. I will note that I didn't come expecting my opponent to base his argument around the contention that the Paris Agreement doesn't do enough. That's really kind of quite an interesting approach, and it's certainly the Paris Agreement is relatively preliminary in some ways. It's the beginning of a process. It's not the fruition of ultimately where we need to be going. Yes, the U.S. should remain in, because to withdraw would be bad for our international standing, it would be bad for our businesses, and it would be bad for our national security. And for many of the reasons my opponent has already just described, withdrawing doesn't actually benefit us in any apparent way, because the Paris Agreement does not indeed impose substantive due obligations on us. I'm not the only one who believes that withdrawal would affect our international standing. As George W. Bush's Undersecretary of State Nick Burns recently put it, and I quote, "I think it would be a major mistake, even an historic mistake, to disavow the Paris deal. In international politics, trust, reliability, and keeping your commitments, that's a big part of how other countries view our country. I can't think of an issue, except perhaps NATO, where if the U.S. simply walks away, it would have such a major impact on how we are seen." It's important to keep in mind that regardless of how anti-Paris forces see the agreement, most of the rest of the world actually takes it pretty darn seriously. That's why more than 120 heads of state showed up at the end of 2015 for the Paris negotiations. It's why more than 170 nations signed the agreement on the very first day it was open for signature. And that's why so many countries formally joined the agreement, that its entry into force provisions were met in October of 2016, just 10 months after the agreement text was agreed to. Normally, it takes years for enough countries to join formally to hit an entry into force approach. The point here is that at every turn, nations of the world as a whole have been making clear that they care deeply about the Paris Agreement, so walking away would do nothing to advance our ability to work with countries that we need to work with, countries like China on issues like North Korea. At the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos in late January, President Xi of China noted that, quote, "The Paris Agreement is a hard-won achievement. All signatories should stick to it rather than walk away." By the way, China installed 34 gigawatts of new solar photovoltaic in 2016, suspended 104 under construction and planned coal power plants earlier this year, on top of about 30, which it did that for last year. Second, walking away from the Paris Agreement would be bad for U.S. businesses. The week after the election, more than 350 U.S. businesses, large and small, from around the country, sent an open letter to then President-elect Trump, reaffirming, quote, their deep commitment to addressing climate change through implementation of the historic Paris Climate Agreement. Additional companies have subsequently signed, taking the total to something over 1,000, including well-known brands such as Monsanto, Hewlett-Packard, Nike, General Mills, Johnson & Johnson, Intel, and Campbell Soup. These companies recognize that climate change is impacting their supply chains and their customer base, and they recognize that their ability to provide low-carbon solutions offers vast business opportunities, ones that they don't particularly want to cede to China and Europe. That's apparently one reason that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said during his confirmation hearings that the U.S. should remain at the table on international climate. Why wouldn't we want to be at the table as the rest of the world is advancing a program to help meet a projected $8 trillion market for low-carbon solutions on energy and agriculture and buildings and transportation? Walking away is also bad for our national security. The current administration's Secretary of Defense, General Jim Mattis, recently noted, quote, "I agree that the effects of a changing climate, such as increased maritime access to the Arctic, rising sea levels, desertification, among others, impact our security situation, and that, quote, climate change is a driver of instability." That's not the first time our military has drawn the connection between climate and national security. The Defense Department's 2015 report on that topic concluded that climate change is, quote, an urgent and growing threat to our national security, contributing to natural disasters, refugee flows, and conflicts over basic resources such as food and water. These impacts are already occurring, and the scope, scale, and intensity of these impacts is projected to increase. And this will aggravate existing problems that threaten domestic stability in a number of countries. Finally, there really is no substantive reason for us to walk away from the agreement. Under the agreement, all parties set their own climate targets, officially called nationally determined contributions, that describe their plans for reducing their emissions. These targets are not, repeat, not legally binding or enforceable, and there's nothing that bars the Trump administration from submitting a less ambitious target than what President Obama set forth. I'll also note that the reporting obligations and the financial obligations that provisions of the Paris Agreement are a continuation of existing obligations that we'd taken on years ago. There's explicit language in the agreement, but again, explicitly acknowledging that the financial commitments, such as they are, which are not specified with any detail, are a continuation of existing obligations only. It's also important to, one note on process, if the U.S. joins the Paris Agreement via an executive, the U.S. did join via an executive agreement. That's not unusual. The U.S., in fact, joins the majority of of international agreements through executive action rather than through Senate ratification. It's also important to note that the real question here is whether the U.S. should remain. The real question is not whether the Paris Agreement will go forward. It will go forward with us or without us. The question is whether we will have a seat at the table. Indeed, we should, for the sake of our national security, for our businesses, and for our international standing. Thank you.
You have 3 minutes beginning
Okay.
from now.
Okay. I think maybe Karen is surprised because she thought I would contest the, I don't like this language, the parade of horribles that we hear about the effects of climate change, which, you know, we've been hearing this for a while, right? I'm not sure that makes a piece of paper any more effective to hear them again. I think the problem of climate change, no matter what you think about it, I finally conclude it doesn't matter what we think about the scientific debates. It is simple in concept to figure out a solution, fiendishly difficult in practice. If we're going to replace all the fossil fuels in the world, or virtually all of them, Al Gore says all of them essentially, then we have to find non-carbon or very low carbon sources of energy that are scalable and affordable. Nobody knows how to do that. Full stop. In other words, what we have is a massive technological challenge and a collective active challenge like we've never seen before. Now, if you're a super optimist, I have some thoughts about energy, technology, and innovation. If you get breakthrough moonshot energy technologies in 20 or 30 years, you won't need the Paris Agreement. The marketplace will adopt them exactly the way cheap natural gas has displaced coal in this country. Most of the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in this country have come because natural gas turned out suddenly to be abundant and cheaper than coal, and the utilities are rushing towards it. In fact, it's interesting to see the technical analysis of the Clean Power Plan that says, actually our plan, page 636 if you want to look it up, isn't really going to change the trajectory of gas displacing coal. Of course, we have to get rid of gas eventually if you know the arithmetic on how this all works. Now, if you're somewhat less optimistic, there is an intermediate world. Well, what if we get like revived nuclear, which is not going very well, but maybe that turns around and maybe we get batteries and other kinds of things to electrify the world. Remember, we got to get to about 900 quads of energy for the world or more. And then if we get something that's close to the cost of cheap coal and oil and natural gas, but not as cheap, and there's also the paradox that if you got something that rivals it, then suddenly people would say, or the price of oil would fall, and you have this sort of back and forth problem like when people ride mass transit to get cars off the road, and then when the roads get free, they drive again, right? That's when you would need a very sophisticated international agreement like our trade treaties that would either have a blend of taxes, incentives, certain kinds of subsidies, as we say, to level the playing field. Now, those kind of agreements, like trade agreements, they take years to hammer out. Instead, we have this framework saying, let's all agree how much we're going to reduce our emissions by. And we do these percent figures like Kyoto. And instead of thinking about the intermediate case where, well, what if we are going to try and figure out a way to have to equalize a playing field in the event that 30 years from now we get closer to it. That's going to require a lot of work. I'm not aware that there's much diplomatic work thinking along those kinds of lines. Thank you. Sorry, that's it. 3 minutes, it says.
Again, I'm surprised to hear that my opponent's primary complaint is that the Paris Agreement doesn't do enough. It does do some things. It does start the process of having all nations in the world for the first time come forward and articulate what it is that they are going to do to reduce their emissions. That is not, Paris has explicit provisions in it that require, that call on countries to come back every 5 years to again articulate their national climate target. It's a joint learning exercise. It's a way for people to say, yes, you know what? We have found ways to more rapidly deploy renewables. We have found ways to more effectively levelize the load and deal with the intermittency and variability of renewables. We have found ways to make nuclear work better. We are finding ways to make carbon capture and storage more cost effective, to solve the engineering problems that Steve rightly points out do indeed need to be solved. The fact that we haven't figured out how to do all that stuff is why it's important to continue to have the United States participate in the Paris Agreement so that we are part of those joint learnings, part of those discussions, rather than turning our back on the one thing that's actually there now, which is the Paris Agreement.
Well, thank you so much. That's the termination of this segment of the debate. And thank you. So question time, and I would like you to fill those little index cards you've got, if you've got questions, and pass it towards one aisle here and the other aisle there, and I think Sean or somebody will collect them and give them to me. It's my role now to ask the presenters questions. I'm only going to ask 4 questions to each. So the first question, and please send those cards down so that I can take a look at them and present them to the speakers. The first question is from you, Stephen Haywood. I don't want to call you Steve because in Oxford I think they call you by your second name, you know, Mr. Haywood or Dr. Haywood. Okay. Assuming that you are advancing withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, how might that be done? And the reason, and this is not a gotcha question because I gave you notice of that, according to Article 28, parties may give notice after 3 years following the entry into force of the Paris Agreement. But such withdrawal will come into effect 1 year after the receipt of the notification. This entails a wait of 4 more years. Is that how you propose to do it, or are you relying on some other provisions of law that might enable us, or you will agree, might allow the U.S. to withdraw?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm not an expert in international law. I mean, I've read that passage in the Accord, and maybe you follow that and it works. It takes a while. I don't know. There's 2 other ideas that occur to me, though. As I say, I'm not sure if they work. But
3 minutes.
3 minutes. I'll be less. Just think of a couple of precedents, or one precedent and one possibility. One is, Bill Clinton signed our name to the Treaty for the International Criminal Court, but then never submitted it to ratification. So it's floating around there when Bush comes into office. So what did Bush do? He sent a letter, after consulting some international law lawyers, I know a couple of them he consulted, he sent a letter to Kofi Annan saying, please remove the signature of the United States from the International Criminal Court Treaty. And they did that. Now, I don't know if that works for this, because executive agreement's a little different than a treaty, an unratified treaty. On the other hand, it seems to me Trump would love to say, if the UN said you can't do that, Trump would love to say, fine, good luck making payroll at Turtle Bay next year, since we're the largest contributor to the UN and there's lots of sentiment for cutting back our contributions. The other one is you might just send it to the Senate as a treaty and say, because I'm actually dislike this long trend we've been doing of executive agreements. I wish we'd go back to doing formal treaties that the Senate ratifies the old-fashioned way. It's in that little thing called the Constitution, right? And then see what the Senate does with it. They might not act on it, or they might vote it down. Either way, I think it dies at that point as a political and practical matter.
Well, thank you, Stephen. I have no right of rebuttal, but I'm going to ask Ms. Florini the next question. My question is, why should the world undertake the very and hugely expensive task of reducing greenhouse gases to below 2% of pre-industrial levels? What is the scientific predicate for doing so? In other words, what is the scientific evidence that supports reducing greenhouse gases?
Well, there's multiple elements. First and foremost, we know that carbon dioxide and other heat-trapping gases trap heat. You can go in the laboratory and measure this with a spectrometer. We know that burning fossil fuels results in releasing more carbon dioxide. We know that we are starting to see impacts of that. For example, in the Arctic, we are seeing our planetary parasol, in the Arctic, which is the ice and snow in the Arctic Ocean, that bounces 93% of the incoming solar radiation that hits the Arctic back into space. As that ice shrinks, we are not 93% isn't bounced back, only 7%, and the remainder of the heat is transferred to the Arctic, accelerating the warming of the planet as a whole. We've now seen that both in the Arctic and the Antarctic, levels of coverage of snow and ice are lower than they've ever been in recorded time. So, but the real question is not, do we care about the temperature? Not do we care about the parts per million of carbon dioxide? It's the impacts that are projected from from accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere. And those impacts are very severe. They are ones that have been known to destabilize existing or prior countries and civilizations. Radical changes in food patterns, radical changes in water patterns. These are significant impacts. They are not guaranteed to happen at a particular time or a particular place. But it is very clear that the risks are significant and may, in fact, the fat tail of the risk is a very, very much a concern. I'm not even mentioning the impacts on non-human ecosystems here. I'm talking specifically about the potential impacts on human communities. And if we think that it really doesn't matter, that drought really doesn't matter, I would invite your attention to Syria, where years of drought drove farmers into cities that were unprepared to accommodate them. Then those resulting unrest led to civil war, that led to a refugee crisis that has had significant political impacts in Europe and elsewhere. Again, these are not guaranteed outcomes. What we are doing is essentially putting the weather on steroids, and the result of that, by trapping more and more heat in the atmosphere, the result of that is more and more extreme events, more and more disruptions of agricultural and water systems, and more disruption of communities around the globe, most particularly affecting the 2 billion poorest people in the world.
Well, thank you very much. And so my second and final question to you, Mr. Haywood, is this, and let me get the question. The Obama administration has already pledged its nationally determined contributions, 20 to 25 to 28% by 2020, by 2020, yeah. How much will it cost to implement the Obama nationally determined contribution? And what are the benefits of doing so?
Well, I have no idea what it will cost, and any estimate, even the EPA's estimates, I think, will turn out to be wrong. I mean, after all, the reduction in emissions that we've had from the rapid dash to gas in the last 10 years, come in way below what anybody would have predicted, 10, 15 years ago. And then the benefit, let's see, two kinds of benefits. There's the climate benefit, which is essentially zero. Understand that actually the International Energy Agency put out a report on this several years ago that was very controversial with the climate community, because they said, look, all the OECD nations can disappear off the face of the earth completely. Their emissions can go to zero today, and it would make no difference in the long-term climate forecast for the entire world. That's why if you read the Obama administration's regulatory impact assessment, it claims big benefits based on, this gets a little technical, an artificially low discount rate that they've never used before at the EPA, which a lot of economists think is pretty dodgy. But all the benefits are from reducing conventional air pollution, which we already have a Clean Air Act for that's working pretty well. So the climate benefits from the Clean Power Plan are pretty negligible. Other benefits, we'll see how they're going to get those anyway. They're counting free benefits, which is happening in a lot of regulation right now.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got a bunch of great questions coming down, not the turnpike, down the stalls here. So the final question I have is for you, and it is this. What are the political, economic, and geopolitical costs of withdrawing from the Paris Agreement?
Will piss the hell out of a lot of our allies and enrage our allies, many of whom have a strong, strong view that it is important for the community of nations to work as the community of nations to address the climate problem. So we can either, and by the way, the other thing is that when the U.S. adopted the underlying UN convention, Framework Convention on Climate Change, it did so by essentially a unanimous vote in the United States Senate. That was in 1992. Subsequently, the Kyoto Protocol was objected to vociferously because it required, it called for action on the part of developed countries, but not developing countries. There was a very explicit call for a new climate agreement to indeed have provisions that apply to climate, to developing as well as developed countries. Well, now we have that. And we're going to decide that we're going to flip them the bird after having said that it's important, that this is what's important to us. Again, I think we would enrage our allies, alienate a number of countries that we are going to need to be working with on issues ranging from rogue nations to terrorism to drug control. And there is no particular reason for us to withdraw. So why alienate our allies? Why undercut our businesses? Why worsen our national security for what? No reason. Mr. Moderator, are we?
Yeah, they're looking
Sorry,
over.
I'm done.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Your 2 minutes are up.
Yeah, yeah. All right, I should interrupt. Okay, no, I'm not going to interrupt. We've got a whole flow of great questions. So, I'm not in a good position to sort of weed them out, separate the wheat from the chaff, as it were. So we pretty much shuffled it, right, like a pack of cards, and we picked the first four that are here. So for good or for bad, here are the questions. So the first question here, and I don't know who's going to answer this, but maybe each of you can take a maximum of 2 minutes. Less than 2 minutes is preferable. So the question is, and if the person who has asked the question wants to clarify it, he or she can do so, why have temperatures continued to increase when we have reduced our emissions? I'm not sure what the basis of that question is, but
Yeah.
We haven't reduced emissions.
No, we
I mean,
haven't.
globally, we haven't reduced emissions. The U.S. has.
Yeah, but they're adding to the.
No, this is the effect is a global effect, and emissions have continued, in fact, to increase. The questioner may be asking about the fact that over the last 3 years, we have seen record-setting temperatures for each of those 3 years, even though for the first time ever, we've seen global emissions from fossil fuel combustion have started to stabilize. But there's a lot of other sources and other gases that are not accounted for in that, and in fact, overall emissions are continuing to go up. And there's a lag time. And in fact, most of the heat that has been trapped on the planet is actually not on the land, it's in the water. And once we do start curtailing our emissions, we're going to see some of that additional heat will come back out of the oceans and re-equilibrate into the atmosphere. That's why one of the big problems with climate change, you can't wait until you see that you've got catastrophic impacts, because you're going to have an awful lot of heat stored in the ocean, and temperatures will continue to rise for hundreds of years thereafter. Not to mention the fact that, as Mr. Hayward has said, it takes rather a while to change energy systems. So if you found you got a problem, you need to be taking action on it. You can't wait till you see that you've got a cataclysmic problem on your hands.
Okay.
Yeah, can I wait? You thought.
Yeah, you can. You deferred to her. Now you want to come back? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Well, just a little bit on the math on this. As U.S. emissions peaked, CO2 emissions, we'll stick with those, peaked at about 6 billion tons 10, 12 years ago. And now we're down to like 5.5, something like that. The climate target of all these international agreements is we need to go down to about 1 billion tons by the year 2050, a level we last emitted in the year 1910, just for reference. And meanwhile, China has now at close to 8 billion tons a year, I think. They're now way ahead of us, on their way up to about 12. I mean, the Paris Agreement doesn't stop China where they are now. They're going to keep going up by a fair bit over the next 15 years. And then they say, then we'll start cutting down our emissions. Well, maybe. They're building more nuclear power plants than the rest of the world combined. And so that's why you can see that even though we've reduced our emissions a little bit, it's not even a drop in the bucket for what needs to happen.
All right, thank you very much. So now I think, Mr. Haywood, that you have got the bulk of the questions. So I'm sorry, I'm just a messenger bearer. Don't inflict any pain on me. So here are the questions, right? So, a collection of questions for you.
Oh,
oh,
okay.
Right. Yeah.
Well.
Geez, so basically, as I understand it, these three questions make the point that if the Paris Agreement is a talking club, or if it doesn't do too much,
right.
Why bother to stay? Let a sleeping dog lie. Why bother about it?
Oh, well, that's why I said at the beginning is I think it's irrelevant. And my guess, by the way, is the Trump administration will not take us out of the agreement for precisely the reasons I've laid out.
Okay.
That we can ignore this thing. It's not really going to do. It's not really a constraint on our fossil fuel industry. It's no big deal.
Okay, all right. So
That's how they're going to come down on it, is my
Yeah,
prediction.
that's-
I was asked to debate a motion,
Yeah.
and I will summarize in my final 2 minutes
Okay.
why.
Yeah, we'll get to it in a minute. But I just want to ask. We just got a few questions of you, which is. Again, I'm going to pose the question as stated here, Ms. Fioroni. The question is, don't you think the technology would be shared anyway every 5 years? I don't know the assumption behind this. It is that we are sort of ratcheting down on emissions, and in the process we are developing new technologies, and I think the question sort of says, shouldn't we share it? You're not opposed to that, are you?
Oh, certainly not. It's a but the Paris Agreement provides mechanisms for us to do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You know what? I think we've kind of, shall we move on to the final part, or do you think we could take a few more questions? Oh, okay, we've got a few more minutes, yeah. I just don't want to take your time, I don't have much to say. Okay. Rather than give you evidence of the fact that I don't have much to say, I'll just ask the audience what to say. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Mr. Haywood, again, right? They say for Stephen, so why don't I call you Stephen? Yeah, what the hell? Yeah. So, low carbon technology not affordable, question mark?
Yeah.
Wind and solar are the cheapest marginal resource in most parts of the world. That's why 100% of new electricity capacity installed in the U.S. by 2060 is I don't get that question.
Yeah, I do.
So if solar and wind, traditional renewables, solar, wind, thermal, are the cheapest marginal resource in most parts of the world, and we can adopt it, what's your problem with having it?
Well, I challenge the premise of that a bit. If you got rid of the production tax credit for wind right now, nobody would build another windmill immediately. They depend on large subsidies. They don't scale up very well, and then people seem to forget they don't run cars and trucks and trains and airplanes, which is about 35 to 40% of our emissions. They don't substitute for liquid fuels, at least not yet. Maybe batteries, but then I want someone to answer the question, where are we going to get the 1,000x lithium you'd need to build batteries on that scale? And how many mines for lithium, they're big open pit mines, how many mines in America are environmentalists going to support? Not very darn many. They're blocking all the mines right now I can think of for copper and other things that go into windmills and solar panels. I don't get it. So that's why they don't scale up. And if you want proof of this, look at Germany's emissions numbers from the last 10 years. They're pushing solar and wind very hard, but their emissions reductions have flattened out. And that's because when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, guess what? You've got to get power from a spinning reserve that right now means gas. And also in Germany, coal. They actually brought 10 coal plants back online. And their emissions are going to go up when they close down all their existing nuclear plants in a fit of madness that I don't also understand.
You want to add?
Yeah, look, the Harvard Business Review ran an article in January pointing out that without subsidies, levelized cost of new wind and new solar is indeed crossed already below coal, and wind, although not solar, is now below that for natural gas. That's why we're not actually getting a lot of new wind, a lot of new gas and coal built in this country. The problem is that for the existing global stock of power generation, it's still about 80% fossil. That's why we need to continue to press forward in developing countries to make sure that as much as possible of the new capacity is indeed low carbon, carbon free. That is going to require some, it's not a dead simple thing to do. I don't want to in any way imply that it is, but we have significant and growing experience on how to actually integrate variable renewables in. We're learning about how to do that more and more effectively through demand side management, through use of low carbon baseload from gas. So there are a number of mechanisms for moving forward with this. And again, what the Paris Agreement says is we're going to work together to try to figure all this stuff out. That if it was easy, we wouldn't need an international agreement. It's not easy, and one of the benefits of having an international agreement and remaining a party to it is then we are in the midst of those discussions and able to have our businesses participating in those discussions as the rest of the world works to figure out how to implement those solutions.
So the final question, which I will embellish a little bit because I too might have liked to see the answer to that, is this. The question asked quite correctly, I think, that the Paris Agreement treats the symptoms of energy consumption, which is emission of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases. And the question is, what do you see as the causes of the problem of energy use? And so if I can add a little footnote to this, the causes of energy use is that we like the goods and services produced by the use of energy. Modern society is constantly converting energy and materials into products that we like. And so it seems like we want to proceed on the basis of increasing consumption of goods and services, and yet want to make sure that CO2 reductions do not measure up to our consumption. So the question is, this is reducing CO2 emissions is according to the question, and I agree with that person, but what do I think? What does it care what I think? The question is, what are the causes? What can you do about the causes for the reason why people are using so much energy?
I'm not exactly sure I understand what the question means by causes. Well, I can try it, though.
So the reason why you have emissions of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases,
I get that part, right?
is because
I have an
people
answer
want
for you,
goods
I
and
think.
services. So the question is, okay, so when you say reduce CO2 or reduce greenhouse gas emissions 2% below pre-industrial levels,
So
right?
you consume less? Is that where you're going with this?
The question is, what are you doing about the fact that we still want the goods and services that result in the carbon dioxide emissions?
Okay, so first of all, I've toyed around with the idea that human beings ought to actually be called Homo igniferens. Is that the right Latin word for it? There's actually some evidence in evolutionary biology that human brains started getting larger when corresponds with us taming fire, our first use of controlled energy for goods and services. Now, yeah, we can actually American energy per capita energy consumption has been flat going down for a while. Some of our energy use numbers in this country are pretty good. The problem is you've got, I'm not sure what the number is now. It's at 800 million, 1.3 billion, something like that, of people in the world who have no energy, or virtually none, no electricity. So the point is you've got a lot of people in the world living in energy poverty. Now, people talk about climate skeptics as climate deniers. What I notice is that every one of the forecasts by the International Energy, like the International Energy Agency of Paris, pretty smart people, our own Department of Energy, they look out 30, 40 years, and they say, yeah, we're using 80% fossil fuels now. By 2040, that's about as far as they look. They say it's still going to be 70%. So then I look at the diplomatic community saying, oh, this agreement's going to get us on the road to all this, and they don't sort of match these things up. That's why I call them reality deniers. And I'll just stop right there.
Yes. Good.
Well, if you look at the track record that the International Energy Agency has and the U.S. Department of Energy have, they've been consistently way under predicting the actual deployment of low-carbon energy. And there's a number of institutional reasons that that's the case. We've hit some important tipping points in terms of dramatic decreases in price. There's every indication that we are going to hit those dramatic decreases in pricing for wind and solar, not to mention geothermal, wave energy, tidal, and a bunch of others that are still making their way into the, if you will, the energy mainstream. The premise of this question strikes me as bizarre, to be honest. No one that I'm aware of is saying we shouldn't have energy. We're saying we should have energy that doesn't emit a pollutant that poses massive risks in terms of destabilizing our civilization. We are, in fact, I'm convinced, smart enough to do both those things. Have energy and have it be low carbon.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I don't want to enter into a debate with you guys. So I'm now going to come to the stage of the proceedings where we are calling for closing statements. You answered questions from the audience, questions from me, and so we're closing statements. And since you, first Steve, started with this, it is
No, actually,
it is Karen's turn to.
Yeah, she's right. You flipped the order on the closing statements, I think.
Yes.
It's the Oxford format, right?
You want to go?
It's
You
fine.
go first.
I don't
Go
know.
ahead.
I'm happy to.
You flipped the order again. All right, that's cool.
Think so.
What do I
don't care. It's fine.
Whatever you want to do.
Okay.
Right. 2 minutes each.
2 minutes. One time in life, I could run a half mile in 2 minutes. That was a long time ago. I'm going to make one argument, one sort of sweeping and analogical argument, and then a closing argument. I'm going to repair to my initial analogy I opened up with about disarmament and peace. You know, Churchill said back in the 30s, disarmament won't lead to peace. If you get peace, then you'll have disarmament. Something Reagan took to heart in the 80s when he'd say to Gorbachev, you know, if in order to trust each other, this will be easy. And that's turned out to be what happened. Once we finally sorted out that we could actually trust each other, reducing nuclear weapons turned out to be easy. That's why I say the equivalent in climate would be if we can make some big breakthroughs in low and no carbon energy, then this becomes easy. And you know, any piece of paper might work at that point. But I'll simply say this. I think we should withdraw from the treaty because it's an act, as I say, of political hygiene, a political honesty, that we've been going through these charades about reducing emissions, and it would focus our attention on the central problem. That just installing more windmills and solar panels is not going to get us very far. We need some really big things. I have lots of thoughts on what they are. I hold them very tentatively. But I put my closing argument this way. I mentioned and actually Karen mentioned all the big businesses who are for the Paris Accord. So if you want to side with Exxon and coal companies and big business in America, then you should vote for this resolution. If you want to side with James Hansen and other climate realists, you will vote no on the resolution. Thank you.
All right, okay.
I'm going to close with a quote from my former State Department colleague, Paul Bodner, who I think actually lives in this part of the world these days. The Trump administration faces a clear choice. Option one, stay in a global agreement designed around a bipartisan blueprint, show up to workmanlike talks, and file required paperwork no one in Washington will read, and lead in aggressively on the commercial side by promoting U.S. clean energy exports and investment overseas. Option two, withdraw, enrage virtually all of our important allies and partners, cede market share to China, and face possible trade retaliation. Regardless of your view on climate change, that is an easy decision, especially if all you have in favor of the only basis for withdrawing is an act of political hygiene. Thank you.
Well.
Absolutely.
That is absolutely great. Thank you for a wonderful debate, both of you. And on behalf of the audience, Alice Madden and me, I'd like to thank both of you for a great and robust debate. We are not, and so before we start voting, can we just applaud these two contenders once again? One more thing and we are done, and in time too, which is that you have now got to register your second vote. So this is our post-debate vote. Please take out your voting clickers and oh, you got it. A in favor, B opposed, C undecided. I asked Alice if there was a prize for the winner, and she says no. Well, we'll take them out to dinner, right? Yeah. We can give them a dinner, on the house. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Please start registering your votes. Oh, wow. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. Let's give both of our
Well, thank you. That was good. You've managed to change hearts and minds a little bit. But minds, yeah. I won't know.
This is a little peculiar since we didn't have a D&E.
No, thank you for coming.
Okay.
Yeah. Keep
And
us
it's still
alive,
moving,
yeah.
which, that's a little strange.
Aye. Oh, yes.
Voting
yes.
fraud.
Oh,